Today we will be discussing the Russian attacks on the flanks of the key Ukrainian defense node Avdiivka. We're going to be looking at attacks on the northern and southern flanks respectively. And I apologize for not covering the war in Ukraine for about a week. I was very busy looking at the situation in Israel, and we will continue to talk about that situation. But we will also be talking about what's going on in Ukraine, especially on the Avdiivka front, as this has been the focal point. A lot of the reporting has been focused on this area. And starting in the early morning of October 10th, the Russian forces, they launched an unprecedented attack with a massive amount of artillery, which targeted Ukrainian positions in and around Avdiivka. There was also a huge amount of MLRS fire and airstrikes that utilized the FAB 1500 high explosive bombs. So here you can see the Russians fire. They're dropping the FAB 1500s with their UMPK glide bomb kits that also have the GLONASS satellite constellation navigation system. So these FAB 1500s, they have 675 kilograms of explosives, and they create a crater of really 20 to 25 meters in width and then a depth of 6 meters. And they're dropped from Su-34 tactical bombers, and these Su-34s can drop 2 of these bombs at a time. On the first day alone, at least 12 of these FAB 1500s were fired onto Ukrainian positions around Avdiivka, as shown in this video. In this video, you can see that the Russian attacks, they included an Mi-28 attack helicopter, and in the video you can see that it launches ATGMs at the Ukrainian positions within the city of Avdiivka itself. In the video, it's also accompanied by an Mi-8 transport helicopter, and you can see that both of these helicopters are flying at a very low altitude, which does show that despite the fact that they're flying at a very low altitude, they're not being targeted by Ukrainian air defense. Also, you can't see any man pads targeting them in this video. But more generally speaking about the air defense, it does show that at least in this specific region, there is a degradation in Ukraine's capabilities of firing onto Russian aircraft and onto their helicopters. And even when there is Ukrainian air defense present in these areas, a big reason why it hasn't been able to stop as many of the attacks by the Russian Air Force is due to the fact that the Russians are using the FAB 500s and the FAB 1500s that could be dropped from tens or dozens of kilometers away from the front line and then make their way towards certain positions, and they won't be 100% precise, but because they have a huge blast radius, it could still cause some significant damage to the Ukrainian positions within the city. One of Russia's prime targets at the beginning of the strikes included the Avdiivka coke plant. This plant is located over here, so you can see it is very close to the front line, but nonetheless, it has a very important value to the Ukrainians. They are amassing a pretty large contingent of forces in this area for defensive purposes, and they've been doing this for a very long time. So a huge chunk of Ukraine's defensive garrison in the Avdiivka area is located over here before they get assigned to like a combat task with their respective companies closer to the front line, further south in Avdiivka. But again, during the night and during Russian attacks, a lot of these Ukrainian forces, they are stationed in this area. I'm sure that Ukrainians also have a lot of their ammunition over here for small arms fire. So yeah, this is a very significant site, and they use the cover of the structures within the coke plant to evade being fired upon by the Russians, which is why you saw such a significant amount of Russian strikes specifically on this coke plant, especially because it is on the northern flank of Avdiivka, which is an area where you had the Russians attacking in that general direction in 2 different arrows specifically. But again, they wanted to degrade the Ukrainian forces' capabilities in this area. The Ukrainians, they have a huge amount of basements and concrete structures that have been fortified over the past 8 years within Avdiivka, and including within the coke plant, because there's always been an anticipation of a fierce battle going on over here because of how close it is to the entire line of contact between the DPR forces and the Ukrainian side since 2014. So in a way, the Ukrainian fortifications over here are actually more sophisticated than the ones in Mariupol, because the ones in Mariupol, they were more hastily created, even though the entire city and the entire Azovstal fortress is much larger. But at the same time, you also have to take into account the fact that now the Russians are utilizing those Fab 1500s, so it goes both ways. There were Russian sources that reported that their attacks on October 10th coincided with Ukrainian troop rotations, so that was a part of why they launched at the same time. So that's when you have Ukrainian forces trying to leave some of their underground fortifications to again be rotated with fresher troops. That at least is their claim. And within the city of Avdiivka itself, the estimate for the amount of forces within this city, not counting all of the areas around it, because in the areas around it, there are way more forces that get rotated in and out depending on the situation. But within the city, it's about 1 to 2,000. Meanwhile, the Russians, they built up a large contingent of forces for their attacks on the southern and northern flanks of Avdiivka. A lot of this came from the cities of Donetsk, from Makivka, and from Horlivka, respectively, where you have a lot of tanks and armored personnel carriers that were moved in towards the Avdiivka direction. You also had the concentration of a lot of Russian units within this area, but not just Russian units, also DPR units. In fact, most of the forces that Russia has on the Avdiivka front are either DPR forces or Russian territorial defense units. And these territorial defense units, they're newly formed. Again, they are less well equipped and they have less training. So when you compare the Russian composition of forces on the Avdiivka front versus, for instance, on the Zaporozhye front, the Russian forces on the Zaporozhye side, they definitely do have better capabilities when adding it up all together. But either way, you have two artillery brigades that are supporting this force. One of them I have mapped over here, and another one is also on the map. You also have some DPR units that do have a pretty sizable amount of experience. Sparta Battalion, Slavyansk Brigade is over here. You have the 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade, and then you also have Somali Battalion. So those are some of the forces, at least in the area just to the north of Donetsk, that are on this front. And then you also do have some Russian units, such as the 9th Separate Marine Brigade. It's not a regiment. I gotta correct that. And yeah, that's generally the Russian force composition over here. You had Russian forces on the southern flank of Avdiivka concentrating a lot of their forces, specifically in Vodiane, before they launch an attack. The first attack, it started off with a singular Russian vehicle that advanced through this open field, most likely in order to clear a path without any mines in the way, in order for Russian forces on the ground, but also for Russian vehicles to advance through the area without having to deal with the minefields, because we saw how during the Ukrainian initial assaults in the direction of Robotyne, on the line of contact, that's where you know there is the highest concentration of mines, and the same thing holds true for what's going on around Avdiivka. So this was the initial assault from Vodiane in the direction of the village of Severonove. So far, despite minor Russian gains in the fields that are directly to the north of Vodiane, there's still no confirmation based on any source or basically any video footage that the Russians were able to enter the village of Severonove. And what we see based off of the other footage from this area is, one, you have this footage over here of a Russian drone that drops a grenade into an abandoned Ukrainian tank. So you can see that some of the fighting is going on in the tree line just at the south of the village. And then again, you have this video over here of Ukraine's 53rd Mechanized Brigade hitting Russian troops with cluster munitions, and that's in the tree line just the south of the one that we just discussed. So you can see this is generally the area where the fighting is going on, with the Ukrainian forces conducting an active defense in this area. Meanwhile, further south around Pervomaiske, the Russians are attacking in this direction. There is fighting going on in the southern parts of the municipality. You also have a lot of Russian TOS-1A strikes onto the village itself, or what remains of it, trying to target every single house, because you know that the Ukrainian forces, they are trying to entrench themselves within these houses. And really, for the course of over a year now, they have been fighting tooth and nail within the village of Pervomaiske and have prevented any sort of Russian advances. Even now, there are no confirmed gains within the village. Now, while the main Russian focus is on the flanks of Avdiivka and not attacking the city head-on, given how fortified it is, there is still a certain Russian effort in the southern outskirts of Avdiivka to clear out some of Ukraine's forward positions that are creating a buffer zone between the current line of contact and actually the houses that are within the city of Avdiivka itself. So for instance, if we look over here, you have this one road over here in blue that I'm running over. The Ukrainians still have positions to the south of it. So the Ukrainians have forward positions that are extremely close to some of the Russian towns that are being used to organize a lot of these attacks. And that includes the town of Spartak, which is just this, to the north of the city of Donetsk and of the Donetsk airports. So in this area, you also had a large congregation of Russian forces, and they launched attacks in several different directions. First of all, in the direction of this highway, just going to the north, you had attacks going on this local road over here, attacks going on this road over here, and then attacks going on specifically on this road, because just to the west of that road, you have this mine shaft, and this is a pretty significant mine shaft. It has underground facilities as well, and there were some pretty large structures over here, and that's a big part of why the Ukrainians have been able to fortify it, dig trenches, and hold on despite numerous different Russian assaults. And so it is a Russian priority in this region to knock the Ukrainians out of these positions. And we already have proof of the Russians being able to make minor gains in this region due to footage from Omega 5, which is the Ukrainian special purpose units, where they hit a Russian trench with an FPV drone in an area that was previously thought to be at least a gray zone or under Ukrainian control. So you do have the Russians trying to clear out some of the trenches over here. And the goal would be to at least get a certain foothold in some of the fortified areas in the southern parts of the city of Avdiivka. Although I will say that the efforts that Russia puts into this part of the front line, just to the south of Avdiivka, will be much less than on the flanks. If you look at the southern part of Avdiivka, it is, again, there's many different facilities, mining facilities, a lot of industry over here, a lot of these production facilities. So there's a lot of good areas for the Ukrainian forces to continue resisting and hold on. And so any sort of fighting over here on a large scale would really be futile, especially when comparing it to attacks on the flanks that have also led to a certain amount of losses that we will be getting into. Now, looking at the northern flank, the Russians also attacked from the village of Krasnohorivka. That was their starting point, and they advanced roughly 2 kilometers all the way to the rail line that has two windbreaks adjacent to it. So that was definitely an area where you did have some vehicles that were riding adjacent to those windbreaks, and that was a means by which they were supplying the Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka. So that's generally a part of why the Russians attacked in that direction. Another reason why is because they also wanted to expand their zone of control past the rail line and either get physical control or at least be able to fire upon very heavily onto the different paths that I've marked in yellow. So I marked these paths many months ago when there were reports after the Battle of Bakhmut that the Russian focus was shifting in this area. You could see in yellow, these are the main local routes that could be used by Ukrainian vehicles to send additional reinforcements and conduct their own troop rotations in and out of Avdiivka. And so that's a big part of why the Russians are advancing on the flanks. They want to try to cut off these areas. I think that a big part of that would also be to reach Orlivka, which is a big sort of hub of these roads where they branch out to different parts of Avdiivka, like towards the train station, towards the city center, towards the coke plant. So that's all being factored in. Another thing that I have seen mentioned is that the Russians are launching this attack in order to divert Ukrainian attention away from their own counteroffensive in Zaporozhye, which could also play a role. There could be two explanations that are not mutually exclusive. In this video, you could see that the two BMPs that were a part of Russia's initial spearhead towards the rail line, they may have been a part of Russia's plan to try to create a path that did not have any minefields in them. That may have been a part of it. Either way, you could see in this video that you have troops dismounting from the two BMPs as they're being hit by the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians, again, they have ATGM crews in this area. They have a lot of minefields laid in this area. They have FPV drones that are hitting the Russian armor. At the beginning of the attacks in early October 10th, in that time, there were reports that there was a lack of Ukrainian counter battery fire. But either way, since then, we've seen that the Ukrainians are still hitting the Russian forces with artillery, including cluster munitions, as they try to advance towards different towns adjacent to Avdiivka. On October 10th, when the attack started, there were reports by Rybar that the Russian forces were able to take over Stepove and reach the outskirts of Berdichi. Since then, those claims have been unsubstantiated, and there really haven't been any other sources backing that up. But again, that is subject to change depending on what goes on as I record this video. And looking a bit to the south, the Rybar map also marks this slag heap over here. This is a slag heap that is a major vantage point, is a major observation post in the region. Like if you send a force over there, a small force, you could stand on it and just overlook the entire region, the entire city of Avdiivka, all the fields to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. You could see the coke plants. So it is a great observation area, and it is also a very good firing position for whichever side controls the slag heap. So that's why the Russians attacked in the area in the first place. So you have Russian attacks not only going to the west of Krasnohorivka, but also to the south of Krasnohorivka towards the slag heap, and also to the area to the southeast of the slag heap, trying to get control of areas adjacent to the very small hamlet of Vesele. And so in regards to the slag heap itself, I can't confirm 100% that the Russians took it over. I know that a lot of people are claiming that they took it over. I'm aware of those reports, but I haven't seen any visual evidence myself confirming it. And I did see that there were at least some Russian sources on the ground that were claiming that they were fighting on the outskirts. So that would be where I have the current line of contact at, but that they had not taken over the slag heap yet. And the fact that they're mentioning heavy battles over this one specific location, it makes you realize that the Ukrainians are holding on to it for a reason. It does have a very important local significance. In this video, which appears to be from the initial attack, I believe that it would be from the 10th of October actually, you could see that there is this pretty large Russian column, which includes tanks, APCs, all of that's in the area just to the north of the slag heap, but they're not going in the direction of the slag heap. They're going in the direction of the red line based on where the road is located. You can see that there's just a huge amount of these vehicles, and they're not really moving. They got stalled. Why they get stalled, it has to do with the fact that there's muddy terrain in the area. There's also a lot of minefields over there. And the issue with having all of these different columns in a highly concentrated area without them moving is that they become a prime target for the Ukrainian artillery. And in this video, you could see just a huge amount of these vehicles. It could be in the dozens actually. And you could see how the Ukrainian artillery is taking advantage of that, despite the fact that some of the vehicles are moving. In some instances, you had the crews that dismounted from the area, and the Ukrainian artillery was able to effectively target the vehicles. Now, in regards to specific claims, the Ukrainian side, they do claim that they were able to destroy, in this one instance, 20 tanks, BMPs, and MTLBs combined, but I can't confirm that myself. The current Ukrainian claim that I've seen circulating is that they've caused the loss of, I don't know if this would mean destroyed, it could be disabled, it could be captured or abandoned, but it would be 15 tanks lost by the Russian side and 30 BMPs, although the number could increase if there's additional footage found, or it could decrease if the Russians are able to retake some of the abandoned equipment from their initial assaults on these fields. So yeah, the situation in that regard is fluid, and really I think this is par for the course whenever you have a mechanized assault, when you are sending a large chunk of your tanks through these roads towards prepared defense lines, towards prepared fortifications and mines. This is really par for the course, just like we saw in Robotyne. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they are trying to hit the Russian rear in this area over here. Here's the geolocation. You can see that the Ukrainians, they destroy a bridge that was supplying the southern flank of Avdiivka, because you could see that the road basically goes in this direction towards villages to the north of Donetsk, attacking the southern flank of Avdiivka. And here you can see the results of what are claimed to be JDAMs, which cause the destruction to this bridge, which will, for a temporary period of time, cause a strain on the local logistics in the area. And finally, let's take a quick look at the elevation map. You can see that on the southern flank, the elevation of the Russian forces starting in Voldyane compared to the Ukrainian positions in the fields to the north, they are pretty similar. Looking at the southern flank or the southern outskirts of Avdiivka, that area, again, pretty even playing field for the Ukrainian and Russian forces alike, as they are fighting for the highly fortified trenches in mine shafts to the south of the city. And then when you look at the area directly to the east of Avdiivka, where there's a highway that runs through, there's really no reported Russian attacks in that area. And that's because, first of all, you would have to attack Avdiivka head on. And second of all, to attack Avdiivka head on, you would be located in valleys and you'd be attacking uphill towards the Ukrainian positions on the high ground within Avdiivka. Avdiivka is over here. And then finally, looking at the northern flank from Krasnohorivka, the Russians are at a disadvantage over here. If you see, the Russians initially started in Krasnohorivka, which is located on a lower elevation compared to the Ukrainian positions that are along the rail line. And since then, they have moved back a bit to the west, but they do still have control of the heights on the slag heap, or at least that was what was reported before. It's still contested, so that could change very quickly, but they do still have control of the heights in Avdiivka itself. And just as a final word about the slag heap, you could see how it could be used as this point to overlook the entire surrounding region, looking at the Ukrainian side and their supply lines, and then also at the Russian side and their supply lines at the same time. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.